everyone, and welcome to Winter on the Web, the Strategic Communications on the Offense webinar. My name is Daphne Marfel. I'm the Communications Research Associate at Berkeley Media Studies Group. And in this training, advocates will explore how to use data to emphasize what is newsworthy about their issue. And as participants, you'll explore how to use data to create news, piggyback on breaking news, meet with editorial boards, submit op-eds and letters to the editor, and develop advocacy ads. So now I'm just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping. If you experience any technical difficulties at all during the webinar, please, we think that probably the easiest way, usually the quickest way to manage these is by calling WebEx directly, and if their number is on the slide on the screen. You can also send a message to us through our chat box. So if you can send a message directly to Heather Gellert by selecting her in the chat box, and she can also help you with any technical issues that you might be having. So now, just to go into a bit about who we are, Berkeley Media Studies Group. For those of you that don't know us, we are a project of the Public Health Institute, and we do research on how public health issues are covered in the news so that we can better equip public health advocates to bring the issues of import to the people who need to know about them. We do media advocacy training, and so we work with community groups, public health departments, and other folks so that they can use the power of the media to advance healthy public policy. We also work with journalists, as you can see on the slide, and this is mostly to really help them understand the public health issues that they're reporting on. So now just back to a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions throughout, please use the chat function. You'll see that in the lower right corner. And it's a little chat box. It's a chat with the little, and you hit the little arrow down, and the chat pops up. And you can just click on the little drop down and select all participants, because if you just send it to hosts or anything, not everyone will see your question. So that's there. And again, if you have any questions about how to do this, you can just select Heather and message her directly. Also, if anyone is having issues connecting to the audio specifically, you can choose Communicate from the Event Center, which is the bar at the very top of your screen. It might be different places on different screens. That's just where it is on mine. But there's a Communicate tab in the Event Center toolbar, and there you can choose audio connection, and then when you click that, the number to call will pop up on your screen. Okay, so we're going to get into the webinar now. So today's presenters, we have Ingrid Daphner-Krasnow. She's a Strategic Communications Specialist with BMSG. Ingrid has provided media advocacy training and strategic consultation at BMSG since 2008. And she bridges her media advocacy expertise with 15 years of experience in reproductive justice, policy change, grassroots communications, and marketing strategies, and nonprofit management. We also have Michael Bacall, who is our Strategic Communications Specialist. He's been with BMSG for nearly 2 years, and Michael helps community organizations and BMSG partners use the tools of media advocacy to achieve their social change and health promotion objectives. And prior to working at BMSG, Michael completed a Fulbright scholarship in Guatemala, where he worked as a science teacher and researcher studying youth empowerment. So with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Michael to take it away from here.
Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the webinar again. We're really so glad to see so many of you on this webinar with us, and we're really excited for not only this webinar and sharing a few ideas related to media advocacy with all of you, but really also for sort of this ongoing work that the Cal Wellness Foundation has made possible. We want to thank the Cal Wellness for making this webinar possible, and also acknowledge gratefully that we have several program officers from the foundation who are with us on this webinar, and they will be available and we will be available on an ongoing basis for folks if you want to work with us more directly with technical assistance or in any other fashion. So we're really excited for this work, and this webinar is really sort of kicking off this 2-year partnership that we're embarking on with the foundation. So I want to start by sharing some of the goals that we have for today's webinar. And the first of these goals is that we're going to learn about how to use media advocacy to influence decision makers. Often in public health, when we talk about communications, there's a lot of emphasis on communicating directly with individuals so that they can become empowered with more information to make healthier choices in their lives. But what's slightly different about media advocacy is that it's about using the media and using communications to influence decision makers so that we can change policies, the policies that shape our environments that affect community health. So we're going to be talking about what media advocacy is and how it can be used. And then we're going to be talking about some of the core elements that make a story newsworthy. We call this our elements of newsworthiness, and as you can all see from the title of today's webinar, the 1-year anniversary of the start of a new administration is a time when there are a lot of news stories related to what has happened in the first year of that administration. And so this is an example of a news hook that we'll be using to get at this idea of the elements of newsworthiness and how you can use these to advance your stories and your narratives through the mass media. Third, we're going to identify ways to leverage the first anniversary of the current administration to advance your policy goals. So this directly ties into what I was saying earlier about using the elements of newsworthiness. And then finally, we're going to brainstorm strategies to advance your desired strategy and frame in news stories on your issue. So one of the major topics that we work on with groups is the idea of framing, and we're going to be talking today about some of the framing challenges that public health organizations face and how you can overcome those framing challenges in your own communications work. So one of the themes that's sort of implicit in the goals that I just shared and that will come up again and again throughout this webinar is that at Berkeley Media Studies Group, we think the news really matters. It's easy to disengage from the news, especially when so often what we see in the news is bad news, or at times it seems like the news is sort of full of celebrity gossip that may not really get at the heart of the issues that are going on in our communities. But at Berkeley Media Studies Group, we actually believe that the news really does matter, and one of the reasons that the news matters, and we'll talk in a little bit more depth about why we think the news is important, but to get us started, one of the reasons we think the news matters is because we know that decision makers pay careful attention to the news. So to start us out, we'd like to ask everyone to share in your chat box a response to the following question. If the only way decision makers got information about your issue, that is whatever issue it is that you work on within your organization, if the only way they got that information was from the news, what would they know about the issue, and then what would they not know? So if the only way decision makers got information about your issue was from the news, what would they know and what wouldn't they know? So please take a minute or two and write your response in the chat box. And then for those who didn't see the reminder, make sure to select all participants in the drop-down menu when you're writing your response in the chat box. That way everyone can see the ideas that others are sharing. It's occurring to me as well, folks on this call are going to be working in a variety of different issue areas. So make sure in your response to explain what issue area it is that you're working on. So just as an example, we have response that says for the issue of climate change, it's often framed as an issue that affects the environment. And so perhaps if decision makers were finding out information about climate change exclusively from the news, they might think, well, this is about the polar bears, this is about, you know, the rainforests and the ice caps on our globe, but this is not about the health of people living in urban cities in the United States. So the health connection to climate change and the environment might not be clear if all you're looking at is the news for your source of information. What other examples do we have? On the issue area of the Affordable Care Act, policymakers may not know that the ACA is being defunded. So an important piece of healthcare news that's perhaps left out of the mainstream media conversation. Another respondent says they would know that there is poverty, that people of color are the focus of areas of crime and lack of jobs and businesses. They would not know that there are many innovations to address the issues. So that gets at another sort of important pattern that we notice when looking at the news, which is that there tends to be significantly more coverage of the problem than there is of solutions. And so that's one, when we talk about advancing public health frames and narratives in the news, part of that is talking more about solutions so that the public can see that there actually are solutions that work to the long-standing problems that we face. So people would know about the dire need of the clinic and surface offerings of the health center, but they wouldn't be aware of hard-hitting issues and the real people. So perhaps the need to sort of, so to speak, put a face on issues. And this is certainly something we'll come back to as well, the connection between individuals affected by issues and sort of the broader context in which those individuals live. On another issue area, we would see that we would know that there is, or policymakers would know there's hunger in America, but not how it's concentrated in our country and what new ideas are in action to address it. So again, talk about the need for more sort of solutions and also, you know, an implicit awareness or implicit lack of awareness in news coverage about issues of equity, that all communities are not affected by issues in the same way. And then I'll just read one more in the interest of time. For the interest of for the issue of immigration, a lot of the news is focused on Latino communities, but they wouldn't know about how immigration policies also affect Asian American communities too. So getting at the idea of stereotypes and sort of particular groups of people that are perceived to be the beneficiaries or the people harmed by particular issues, and perhaps not seeing the full cross-section of the population that's affected by a particular issue. So these are all sort of good. Yet another comment here, another idea about nuclear weapons. We would know that nuclear weapons exist, but would not know that the U.S. is the only country that has used nuclear weapons, has preemptively invaded other countries. So with regard to foreign policy, we know a lot of you know, sort of foreign policy issues of war and peace are not adequately covered in the news, and on and on and on. So this is a perfect example, a perfect sort of brainstorm of kind of the current state of news, and also the reason we pose this question to begin with is, as I stated earlier, decision makers, one of the ways they get their information is from the news, but not, you know, but the news isn't only a source of information for policymakers. The news is also sort of a barometer for what policymakers believe that their constituents care about. And so our next slide really gets at what we call the key functions of the news. And so we describe three of these key functions. The first is that the news plays an agenda-setting role. That means it influences what we think about. So if an issue is not talked about in the news, unless we've had personal experience with that issue, we're probably not going to know much about it. So there's an important agenda-setting function that the news plays. But then not only does the news influence what we think about, it also shapes how we think about it. So the news shapes the debate, and this really gets at the question of framing, how issues are talked about, what's brought into view and what's not into view really influences how policymakers understand. And critically, as many of you brought up in sort of your sort of the comments you shared at the beginning, oftentimes what's not known is the solution to the problem. So the good work that community organizations are doing throughout the country to address these many issues oftentimes is left out of the news story, and that's why it's so important that we engage with the news so that these important solutions are brought to the forefront of the minds of policymakers and the public. And then finally, as I alluded to earlier, the news is important because it influences what can be done to address problems. The news reaches decision makers and opinion leaders, and so sort of the more the more coverage and the more prominent news coverage is about a particular topic, one of the functions that we believe that plays is it sort of bumps that issue up the priority list or up the agenda for policymakers. And so sort of it's on that basis that we engage with this practice of media advocacy, because we know that oftentimes for groups to get the policy wins that they want to see, they need greater public awareness about the issue, but you know, most importantly, they need policymakers to prioritize the issue. So that's why we believe that the news is so important. So one other key idea that we want to use sort of before getting into sort of the core topic of this webinar, which is how do we use the one-year anniversary of the new administration as a news hook to get coverage around the issue, is the idea of layers of strategy. So one of the things that makes Berkeley Media Studies Group perhaps a little bit different than the way other organizations approach communications is that we don't typically start by developing a message. We actually start by thinking about what's the overall strategy. In other words, what's the overall goal that your organization is trying to achieve. And then we work backwards from there to develop messages and to try to figure out how to get that message out there through the mass media. And so in our layers of strategy approach, we break down media advocacy into essentially 4 different steps, these 4 different layers of strategy. And folks will see that in your chat box, we've just shared a PDF slide that goes into a little bit more depth around these 4 layers of strategy. So what are these layers of strategy? Well, the first one is what we call overall strategy, and this is the foundation. This is sort of community organizing, policy advocacy 101. Overall strategy is concerned with the basic questions of what's the problem that you're trying to address, what's the solution that you want to enact, who has the power to fix the problem, and then who are the allies that you can mobilize to put pressure on your target audience to get them to pass the policy or make the change that you want them to make. So that's the foundation. Once you've gone through and discussed your overall strategy, the next layer is what we call media strategy, where you ask yourself the question, do we want to engage the media? Will media attention further our objectives, or will it actually harm our goals? And then if you've decided to use the media, the question becomes, what media outlets will your target be likely to read or watch, and how do you work with those media outlets to actually tell the story? And then comes the layer of strategy that we're all most familiar with when we think about communication, which is message strategy. And message strategy is simply, what do you say, or what do you write? But then it's not only what do you say or what do you write, it's also who's saying it and who are they saying it to. And then finally comes access strategy, which is the question of, once you know what it is that you're trying to say, once you know what outlets you're trying to deliver your message through, how do you actually get those outlets to care? And that's going to be a big theme that we talk about today as we talk about news hooks based on the one-year anniversary of the inauguration. So this next slide goes a little bit deeper into that first of the 4 layers of strategy, overall strategy. So fundamentally, we need to sort of even before we begin to develop messages, we want to start by answering this set of questions. What's the problem? What's the solution? Who has the power to make the change that we want to see? Who has to be mobilized to apply pressure? And it's only then that we get to the question of what's our message? In other words, what is it that the targets need to hear? So we'd next like to give everyone sort of one more opportunity to sort of share some of your own thoughts. As we get deeper into sort of this question of how to develop news hooks, it's important that we start by having a particular goal in mind. And so we'd like to ask everyone to take a few moments just to sort of brainstorm. Perhaps you can talk, if you're with others in your organization on this webinar, perhaps you can talk with them. But we just have 3 simple questions for you to respond to related to overall strategy. First of all, what's the change that you're trying to create? Who has the power to implement that change? And then finally, who are some allies that you can mobilize to reach your target? So once again, if you can share some responses to those 3 questions in your chat box, that would be great. So we have one really good example to start out on the issue of healthcare access. So the problem is that access to healthcare, or sort of another way to put it, the solution rather, is, or what we want to see is we want to see access to healthcare for all and access to healthy food in all communities. So clear solution. The group with the power to enact a change is California legislators. And then who do we mobilize? Well, we mobilize policymakers, environmental justice organizations. Oh, I think I'm jumping between different responses. This is going to be a little bit tricky to follow. If folks can actually perhaps write out their 1, 2, 3 and hit submit all at once. Otherwise, I'll be mixing and matching as we go. But that's okay. The main thing is we just want you all to be kind of, having in the back of your head, an actual policy change that you're trying to see here. So back to the first example, access to health care. The target audience would be California legislators. Some of the allies would be State Free Clinic Association. So that's a great thought. Anytime you have, sort of a pre-existing coalition or organization that can advance your goals, that's a natural group that has, really, power in moving stakeholders to action. And we'll just share one other example just in the interest of time so we can move into the next section. But we also have the issue area of trying to have greater accessibility of resources for women in particular with HIV, so greater access to HIV resources for women in Contra Costa County. And then finally, for a third issue area, we have, the policy goal of locally owned economic development and growth through food. Residents, TA providers, and funders would be in a position to implement the desired change. who would be mobilized, funders, entrepreneurs, trainers, local family farms, institutions. So these are all great examples. It shows that, the folks who shared out, are sort of already orienting themselves to this sort of layers of strategy approach. And what I really want to draw everyone's attention to right now is, in a quick sort of format like this, we're not getting into the real nitty-gritty specifics of what's the specific policy language and, what specific entity has the power to implement the change. All of that is the kind of thing that's developed in a strategy session over, days and weeks and months, not a couple of minutes. But the important thing that we want to draw everyone's attention to right now is the fact that it's a fundamentally different exercise to develop messages when you're messaging towards a specific goal than when you're just developing messages to inform the public about an issue. And when we talk about strategic communications, we're really talking about the former. We're talking about messaging that is working towards a particular end, and that particular end oftentimes is policy change, whether that policy is a state bill or simply a policy that's enacted by the board of a local community clinic. Whatever the change is, communications, from our perspective, is best when it's working towards a particular desired outcome. So thanks so much, everybody, for sharing out those thoughts and perspectives. And now I'm going to hand it over to Ingrid, who's going to talk a little bit about the topic of framing. And I will need to pass. All right. Well.
Thanks so much, Michael.
It's all yours.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thanks, Michael, for that great explanation and introduction to the layers of strategy and to overall strategy. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to Daphne for the kind introduction and to all of our California Wellness Foundation colleagues who are on the line. I want to chat a little bit now about framing. So the next few slides are going to take us through the concept of framing and how framing evolves our thinking as advocates into the messages that we send to decision makers, as well as the way that those messages are received. So framing as a concept, we define it as the mental structures that help people understand the world. What does that mean? Basically, they're shortcuts that your brain uses when you hear certain words or you see certain images or you think about certain concepts based on our collective experience as humans from early childhood on through adulthood and even the experiences of our parents and grandparents who influence our thinking and the society around us. We associate certain concepts and images and sounds with other concepts. And so our brain immediately goes from point A to point B without even thinking about it based on that conditioning that happens all around us. So the way that we think about it at BMSG is as a house. Basically, that our brain is like the structure of a house, and that information walks into that house and immediately gets categorized into different rooms of that house. And where it goes in your own individual house depends so much on your life experience, your education, the language that you speak, the people who you surround yourself with, your family, culture, and values. And so when you say, when you use certain language in your communities, it may be interpreted one way by one person and another way by another person. And the importance of this in the world of media advocacy is we want to frame our issues in the ways that they're meaningful to us and also so that they resonate with decision makers so that they are making the kinds of decisions that we want them to make. And I'll just give you a quick example of kind of that filter of how the information gets into the house and then what room it goes in. I oftentimes get asked, what kind of work do you do? And if I start out really generally, I say, I work in public health. And if I'm talking to a group of other advocates, they're going to ask me, do you design programs? Are you an epidemiologist? Or what kind of public health work do you do? And then I go down the road, well, actually, I work in health communications and media advocacy. But if I'm talking to a group of lay people, maybe some parents or people in my family, just hearing the word health people automatically assume that I'm a clinician. And they say, oh, are you a physician? Are you a nurse? Are you a radiologist? What kind of health care do you provide? Because when people hear the word health, that's what they associate it with most often if they're not familiar with the concept of public health as an industry. So that's just a simple example of framing, but one of the reasons that framing is so important in media advocacy is because we make those associations between concepts without even thinking about it. Again, like I said, based on our own life experience. So I want to do a quick example here. I want you to look at this slide, and in the box, type out what you see. And it's not a race, nobody wins, but just whenever you see it, tell me what you see. And if you don't want to ruin it for other people, or if you don't look at the chat box if you don't want to see what other people are saying. I'll just give it one more second to see what ideas come up. Okay, so it looks like from those who have responded so far, everyone is seeing the same thing, that it says health equity. And everyone is making that assessment based on basically what they can see at the top of that orange box. But if you take away the orange box, you see that, in fact, it doesn't say health equity. In English, at least, it doesn't say anything at all. But what we – oh, yay, I'm so excited that somebody was impressed. Jessica, thank you for your response, because some people have seen this before, and I think it's like the best part of every training that we ever do, and I always want people to get excited about it, so thank you for being excited. What happened there is we read this, and we looked at it, just how much of that information did we have? We only had 50% of the information, but we made an assumption about what was underneath that orange box based on a few different factors, based on our English language capacity, based on the fact that we're all in the social justice realm, and the concept of health equity means something to everyone here. If we were in a room full of physicists, for example, we may not get the same kinds of response. Health equity may not be on the tip of their tongue. And so we learn through this exercise that people all the time make assessments of their surroundings, make assessments of our policy issues, make assessments of our communities based on a limited amount of information. And so if we want to be strategic in our communication strategy, we need to know what information our audience already has about our issue, and we want to make sure that they get the information that we think is the most relevant, and that we think about how that information is going to land with them so that we know that they are also going to think it's as relevant as possible. One of the things that we like to remind people about at Berkeley Media Studies Group is you can't be comprehensive and strategic at the same time. I'm going to say that again because I want everyone to write this down and put it on a Post-it next to your computer. You can't be comprehensive and strategic at the same time. What that means is everyone on this webinar is an expert in their field. And our temptation is to provide our audience, whoever we're talking to, with every possible bit of information that we have about our issue in hopes that something will stick, in hopes that we can convince them either through our expertise or providing such a comprehensive explanation that we're going to convince them of our case. And the truth is that human beings only have a limited capacity of listening and of understanding and of processing information, and because of the way that our brains frame this information, we have to be really strategic about what information we decide we want to deliver to those decision makers who have our issues in the balance. And so one of the things that we want to do is shift the balance of stories in the news from stories that are primarily focused on personal responsibility to one that is more focused on institutional accountability. What does that mean? If you look at most news stories, many of them, because of our mainstream culture, are focused on individuals picking themselves up by their bootstraps and figuring out how are we going to get to where we need to go. But the truth is, as we know, that institutions and policies have far more to do with the well-being of our communities than any one individual action. Sure, do we need to be responsible for our families and try to eat healthy and get exercise and all of those things? Of course we do. However, we know from looking at our history, from looking at the many, many, many damaging policies that we've had over our history and that we currently have, that if we don't take some accountability, if we don't hold our institutions to accountability, then we're not going to be able to affect the kind of change that we want to see. And that means that news stories also need to shift their frame from that one of picking yourself up by your bootstraps to one of institutional accountability. So what we're trying to do through media advocacy is shift that balance in the newsroom to one of more institutional accountability. So one way that we do that, and one of the primary ways when we get into our message strategy, is coming up with a three-pronged message. The first one is, what's the problem? What's wrong? What am I trying to solve? The second one is, what do I think needs to be done about it? And that's important because so many news stories and so many messages just talk about the problem. And I know that I'm sure you all have this experience of reading news stories and not seeing any solution in that story and feeling really desperate and hopeless after you read that story, whereas a story that has some solution proposed is going to be a lot more invigorating. And third is, why does it matter? Or another way to talk about this is, what happens if I do nothing about this? So what's wrong, what should be done, and why does it matter? And so here's a quick example. I'm just going to let you read this on your own because I want to get to a quick exercise. We really want to get into the meat of the first anniversary news hook, so I want to move quickly through some of these concepts. But reflect that. You can keep this with you. Reflect back on this as you are working on your own messages so that you always have a message that has the answer to what's wrong, why does it matter, and what should be done, and who has the power to make the change. You'll see in the last section of this, the city of Stockton is named. So you want to be really specific. We tease our participants in our live trainings that oftentimes people say, oh, the community needs to come together to solve this problem. Well, if we're calling the community together to solve a problem, of course that matters. But at the end of the day, if we use that language, no one individual person or body is held accountable. So we want to make sure that we're holding a specific body, institution, or person accountable. So I'd like to ask you to look at this quote that we've all heard from the National Rifle Association: guns don't kill people, people do. And I'm going to ask, if you were an advocate on the gun control issue, and maybe we have some advocates on the phone that work on this issue, how would you want to change this frame? What would you add to this message to make it more focused on the problem, your solution, and who has the power to create change? Now, we're asking you to do this in 30 seconds, and people spend months and months and months developing their messages, so we're putting you on the spot. But just to sort of get your brains thinking a little bit, I want to ask you to think about how would you reframe this concept that the issue of gun violence has nothing to do with guns, it has everything to do with people. What would you say differently using those three components of a message? And there's no right or wrong here. This is just an exercise just to get you thinking. Okay, so Dana is changing some language, saying guns are killing tools. And so then, Dana, what would you add to your message in terms of establishing accountability? Okay, so Allison has an idea for a solution. Gun access should be curbed in order to keep our community safe. And then I want to make sure I pronounce your name correctly. I want to say Tigist, but I apologize if that's not how you pronounce your name. People are dying. So Tigist is saying this is the problem. This is why this is so important. But you can see that what we want to do with our strong message development skills is tie all of these things together so that when we're talking to a legislator, we're talking to a funder about our program, we're talking to a collaborator, they get all of that information. What's the problem? What's the solution? Why does it matter? And who has the power to make that change? And I encourage you to go to the worksheet that Heather just sent out. And you can make a bunch of copies of this in your offices and use this every time you are developing talking points for any of your meetings, because this is kind of bread and butter communications on how to make sure that your message is really as effective as possible. So I want to pass the mic, so to speak, back to Michael, who's going to tell us a little bit about what makes a story newsworthy.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Ingrid, and thanks everyone for sharing those really challenging examples of how you would reframe a tough issue. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and sort of get into this question of what makes a story newsworthy. At Berkeley Media Studies Group, we've identified sort of a set of what we call the elements of newsworthiness. And you can basically, I find it most helpful to understand the elements of newsworthiness by really putting yourself in the shoes of an editor. So actually try to imagine that you're sort of, in a newsroom environment, and you're an editor and you're trying to figure out what's going to go on the front page of the newspaper for that day. And you have reporters who are coming up to you left and right and they're saying, hey, I've got a good story about this, I've got a good story about that. What's going on? How does that editor make a decision about what story she's going to put on the front page of the news that next day? So these are some of the criteria that we've actually found through research. These are some of the factors that make a story newsworthy. And so the first one of these is controversy or conflict. So when there's, we can think about, the recent news of, all of the, many, Hollywood celebrities that have been involved in, sexual misconduct, the many, prominent politicians, think about how much news attention this has gotten. Of course, the issue underlying it is extremely important, but the issue has been important all along. Why is it just now that this is making news? And one of the reasons, for better or for worse, these are simply, this is simply the observation. This is what happens in the real world of journalism, is that these are controversial topics, and that is one of the factors that makes a story particularly newsworthy from the perspective of an editor. Another important element of newsworthiness is irony. When something is sort of ironic, that tends to make it more likely to be covered and picked up in the news. When there's an injustice, when something is clearly unfair, a community that is sort of, being, sort of bearing the brunt of responsibility for a social problem. Think about it, environmental injustices, waste sites that are dumped in communities of color and in low-income communities and not in more affluent communities. That's another example of the kind of thing that can be seen as newsworthiness if you pitch it to the editor from this perspective of injustice. Another is anniversary, and in a few moments we're going to be talking about how the anniversary of sort of the, new presidential administration is another example of a newsworthy element. When a story is of broad public interest, that's another factor that a journalist or an editor will look at and say, okay, this is something to talk about because we know this is of importance to a broad cross-section of our readership. A breakthrough or an important milestone. Think about sort of, when sort of if there's sort of a new breakthrough in how, in how, a particular illness is treated. Think about a scientific breakthrough, for example. A personal angle, often personal stories. Think about stories that happen around the holidays that tell, stories of individual families, who are in need of assistance. Personal stories can often be covered, for example, in the features section of a local paper. Celebrity, sort of to the point that I was making at the beginning, again, for better or for worse, this is simply the observation that we know that celebrity celebrities tend to attract a great deal of news coverage. We all know this. And then, something that's important to consider is that another factor that journalists have to think about is, is there a visual component to this story? So if there's a compelling visual, particularly for TV news, a compelling visual makes a story much more likely to be picked up and covered in the news. And then finally, another important news hook can be sort of a seasonal or a holiday link. Around Thanksgiving time, there are frequently stories about giving back and through, turkey feeds and so on and so forth. So, around Valentine's Day, there might be stories that are somehow connected to the theme of love. And so when you're thinking about how is it that we make our issue, which we work on 365 roughly days out of the year, how do we make this issue relevant to news? You can think creatively about each of these different elements of newsworthiness and think about on the basis of which one of these might we pitch a story to a reporter. They may not cover it every day of the year, but if you can somehow tie it to a particular holiday link, for example, maybe that'll make the story relevant. Or if you have a celebrity who is willing to get behind and back your cause, maybe that'll help make the issue more newsworthy. So when you're trying to consider how to gain access to the news media, that fourth and final layer of strategy, these are sort of tools that you can use to help kind of spark some creative thinking about how to pitch a story to the news media. So there's another sort of set of elements that we share when thinking about how to pitch stories to gain access to the news media. So the first, like I said, was really putting yourself in the shoes of an editor and trying to figure out, will your story sort of meet these criteria of newsworthiness? But then there's sort of another sort of set of skills and set of sort of elements that we like to encourage advocates to think about, which is now from the perspective of a journalist, what's going to make this a rich and compelling story to tell? And so we call these story elements because, journalists don't cover issues, journalists cover stories. And there really has to be a storyline. A storyline involves characters and plots and sort of challenges that those characters overcome. And so story elements are a way to sort of think about how to tell sort of richer, more compelling stories. So we're just going to go through these fairly quickly just to sort of mention what these four story elements are. The first is what we call authentic voices, and these are individuals who can speak to an issue from firsthand experience. The second is social math, which is a strategy for making large numbers more graspable for people. An example, 1,000 people quit smoking every day by dying. That is equivalent to 2 fully loaded jumbo jets crashing every day. So making, a large sort of difficult number to conceptualize more easy for people to digest. And then finally, visuals. As I explained earlier, visuals are one way to make a story, to make an issue really come to life. And so now we're going to get into sort of how we can use sort of the first year anniversary of the new administration as an example of a news hook. So I'll pass it back to Ingrid at this point.
Thanks so much, Michael. So we want to dig in a little bit to the concept of this first year calendar hook. As January is coming up, we want everyone to be able to use this calendar hook to advance their media advocacy strategies. And there's no doubt that there are going to be questions, there are going to be stories on how the current administration has been handling the issues that it's been faced with. That's happened the news media has covered this first-year anniversary for administration, many administrations over time. And so we can expect this to happen. And so one of the things we want to encourage you all to do is how can you use this calendar hook in order to advance your specific media advocacy strategy and your policy goals. So I want to just go through a couple of sample news story themes that we often see when the news media is talking about how a current administration is doing just after the first year. So one is making good on campaign promises. The current president said that he or she was going to do X, Y, and Z on healthcare, X, Y, or Z on immigration, X, Y, or Z on national security. Are they doing those things? Are we better off for it? Which leads us to the next one, the quality of life of the average American. I think someone in the comments, one of our participants said, you know, are we really paying attention to what average Americans are going through? And do we have a good sense of what those average Americans are experiencing based on the current policies? Also, every president is going to encounter certain crises, and how they handle those crises is for sure going to be evaluated after that first year. So we want to make sure that we are leveraging this anniversary hook to promote the news stories and the frames that we want to see around our issues. So there's just a couple of examples here I'll go through. This is a story on President Obama's first year in office. And you'll see this red circle shows the question is, do you approve or disapprove of the way Barack Obama is handling the job as president? So this would be based on some of the campaign promises that President Obama made on the campaign trail, and then how he followed through with those campaign promises, as well as anything that came up for him unexpectedly. And I encourage you to go to the link at the bottom of this page, because this source is a very interesting example of how to use the news hook of the first year anniversary, and might give you some great ideas. This one is an opinion piece on George W. Bush, and this is actually a response to his State of the Union in 2002, so just the first year after he was elected. And it really gets to the idea of, are Americans better off? President Bush is suggesting that Americans could have it all, spending on defense, domestic security, social programs, and tax cuts. And so is that really the case? Do we need to analyze that further? This is what the New York Times suggested was his key message in his State of the Union, and is this accurate? I also want to share this really fascinating resource from C-SPAN. I encourage you to go to the link at the very bottom of this page. I won't go into the details of the photo right now, just in the interest of time, but it's basically a comment on every president is going to face some kind of crisis in his or her administration, and we want to make sure that we're holding our electeds accountable for how they handle that crisis, but even those who are the most prepared. And Dick Cheney, Vice President Dick Cheney, was talking about how their administration had incredibly seasoned foreign policy experts in that administration, and when it came to the coup attempt in Panama, they did not respond as well as he thought they should. And the best way to learn something is by going through it. So we could anticipate that the Trump administration is probably going to face some criticism on how they dealt with the many weather disasters that we've had just in this first few months of his administration. But this is a really fascinating resource that would give you some really interesting ideas on how you might assess what you would call into question about the current administration and where you want to see them do better. So I'd like to invite you to use a chat function on what are some stories that you might want to see the news media cover on your issue and the anniversary of the Trump administration. What are some issues that you think are going according to the way you'd like to see them? What are some issues that you think really need improvement? How do we need to hold our policymakers accountable? And how can we use that anniversary hook in order to call them to task? Say, hey, you've been in office for a year. This is what's happened. We want to see you do better, and this is how. This is the problem that we're seeing, and these are some solutions, and these are the people who we want to hold accountable. So I want to invite you just to brainstorm. This doesn't need to be in-depth, but just some quick ideas of if you could be in charge of the front page of some of the major papers in your area, what would be the stories that would be coming out of those papers? On the radio, on the the favorite blog that you follow. What are going to be some of the stories that go viral on social media? That kind of thing. And I'll share one just while I have the floor on the phone while folks are thinking. That I live in, I work remotely for BMSG, and I work in a small town in Wyoming where housing, very much like many other towns and cities across the country, is at a premium, and there's just simply not enough housing for our workforce. So I would like to see that issue covered in that first anniversary of the presidential administration, talking about housing policy at the national level and how it comes down at the state and local level as well. Allison is saying, a year with healthcare under Trump. Right, so Allison, I would just encourage you to, I know I'm saying, just think generally, when you think about this in your office back with your colleagues, what are some of the high points and low points of the healthcare policies under the Trump administration that you want to call to task? And where do you want to see those policies improve? I know that Daphne has been collecting general questions. And so what I want to do is pass the ball to her, but before I do that, just to field some questions, but before I do that, I want to just let everybody know that through a grant from the Wellness Foundation, we are able to make technical assistance available at no charge to grantees over the next couple of years, and that's going to start in the next few months. And so we want to encourage you to get in touch with us. You can email me directly at daphnekrasno@bmsg.org to find out. And what we'll do is we'll learn a little bit about what the issues are that you're working on and figure out what are some of the strategies that you want to learn more about and where we can help you build the capacity within your organization to use media advocacy more effectively. And you'll see that there's also that my email is also going to be on the evaluation that you'll get when you hang up from this webinar. So with that, I will pass the ball to Daphne, who is going to let us know what questions have come up.
Thanks, Ingrid. So actually we haven't had general questions throughout. So if anyone we have maybe time for a couple quick questions. And if anyone has any, if you want to just type them in the chat box now, and we'll maybe have time to answer one or two questions for Ingrid and Michael.
And I just want to mention while folks are thinking, we laid the groundwork for media advocacy and for framing and story elements, and we're using this anniversary hook as one example of one of the fantastic ways to make a story newsworthy. There will be stories undoubtedly on that first anniversary. So we want to make sure that advocates are using that opportunity as effectively as they can. It's one of those unique opportunities where there's going to be news. So how can you reach out to your colleagues at your local paper, the radio? How can you write something on your blog that is going to take advantage of that? Not everything is a sure thing, but we know that there's going to be stories on that first anniversary, so we want to use it as effectively as we can. And thanks, Allison, for sharing some of these great ideas on healthcare and on the women's movement and sexual harassment.
So Ingrid, we have a question from Lisa, who's asked, what is the best way to understand how people with worldviews think and can hear what we have to say?
I would need a little bit more information on what you mean by worldviews. You're saying, Lisa, if we don't know someone well, how do we know what their perspective is on an issue that we care deeply about? Is that right? You can just write into the chat yes or no, or explain the far right views. So one thing is doing as much homework as you can about your target audience. And one thing that's really interesting is I think that generally, just given the polarization in our country, especially in a two-party system, we tend to lump people into big categories. And it turns out that when we get down to issues, on an issue-by-issue basis, people have really individual beliefs. And that we know from the research that people make decisions far more often based on their personal values than on any data that we present to them, or even along party lines when it comes to a personal level. So one of the things that's really important is to learn as much as you can about the specific individual that you're going to be talking to. What is their position on the specific issue that you are thinking about? I'll give you a quick example. We're running out of time, or maybe we're out of time, but we know that you know, issues that in some communities can be really controversial, thinking like vaccines. You might find a policymaker whose child either did or did not get a vaccine, and based on their own personal experience, maybe their perspective was one way on vaccines, and then because of their own personal experience, they may flip-flop on that issue because of how it affected them personally. And Lisa, I'd be happy to talk. It's a really tricky question to answer in a short amount of time, but I would be happy to talk more offline with you. It sounds like the question about being strategic and comprehensive at the same time. Thanks, Heather, for answering that so quickly. We are out of time, and I want to just see if there's anything else that we need to share with our participants before we move along. An hour is never long enough. We always want to share more time with you. We are going to be delivering this webinar again on November 30th. So if you feel like just getting a refresher and hearing some of these concepts again would be helpful, please do join us. And Daphne, I'll just pass it back to you if there's anything else that we wanted to share with the group before we log off.
Great, thanks, Ingrid. Well, here's just BMSG's info so that you can all keep following us. Our website is bmsg.org, and I know Heather's been sharing lots of materials with you all, but if you go to the publication section on our website, there's a lot of really valuable material there that can help you with any future media advocacy efforts. And then you can also follow us on Facebook and on Twitter for more updates, and you can always email us at info@bmsg with any questions. So thank you so much to everyone for attending.
Thanks, everyone.